Welcome to this special occasion where we do a nerd talk about pen and paper. I got myself three beautiful guests here. Me, myself, you might already have seen me. I'm Chris from CampusTV. I did the last online pen and paper stuff. And with me are, for one, Wes.
Hi, I'm Wes. I'm a freelance designer for multimedia projects, most of the time graphics, and I'm a nearly decade-long GM and designer of many a hubbub around D&D and other RPGs.
All right. The man, the myth, the legend, Jochen Kubek.
Yeah, hi. I'm here from University of Bayreuth. I'm teaching video games, culture, history, and game design. And I already participated in the last live role-playing session and had quite a lot of fun.
And last but not least, Vincent.
Hi, I'm Vincent. I am a co-student of Chris's. I did the first pen and paper live session. Some of you might have seen it. And yeah, I'm kind of functioning as a guest / co-host for this particular session.
Okay, we're gonna start in the beginning with this talk. How did you first get into contact with pen and paper?
Oof. The very first contact was a long time ago. I think it was I don't even know what cartoon anymore, but I think I was watching a cartoon when I was 8 or 9 that had some offshoot episode with some D&D stuff in there. And I got interested in wait, what is this? I think my second real big, I did a little bit of research, found a little bit out of what it is, but didn't have the friends to play it with, nor parents that understood what it was or how to get it for me, because where I lived, there was no way for me to get any of that at that point in time. I think the second big way how I got into contact with D&D is, for those that know it, the Dungeons & Dragons movie with Jeremy Irons, which I had on VHS, because I found it on the market somewhere nearby. And after that, I think with some friends in high school, we got the Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition books. Never really got far into actually playing it, but someone had a red box, so I did a lot of reading into it and did a few one-shot sessions until a year or two later, I got to start a Pathfinder group with a bunch of people, with someone DMing for me. And from there, it kind of started growing out with, at some point, I started running my own games. As per usual, everyone, I already kind of knew I'd like running games because I'm the person with all the voices. So I knew that was going to be a thing for me anyway. But especially with Pathfinder, I wanted to get a little bit of a better grasp on the rules first. And from there, I just kept spreading out with different RPGs when I could, eventually also moving on to 5e. Because, surprise, surprise, it's a lot easier to find players with games that aren't there to break your brain. And yeah, by now we're 8 or 9 years in. So nice. That's for later. This was about how we got into it. So here we are.
Hey, Jochen, how about you?
Yeah, I think my first contact with the concept of role-playing game was in the movie E.T. from 1982. There's a famous scene in the beginning where they're at the table and playing something I didn't understand at the time when I watched the film. And in 83, the D&D basic rules, it was the red edition, came into the local toy store. And I think it was immediately I fell in love with the concept, so I bought it. Or I get it bought, I don't remember. And I convinced two of my friends in the class who were in this chess computer group we made at school. And we played it. And I was DMing from the very beginning because I was the one with the rule set. I knew the rules. I read it everywhere I went. And I think I played for 10 years in the 80s, during the 80s. And it stopped when I graduated from school, and then I changed town and I was going to university, and I just stopped. I had my share, I think, of role-playing. We tried some other systems coming out at the time, but it was the 80s, so there were no internet, no digital communication. We did it on paper. We organized our local role-playing convention with handmade, hand-drawn posters hanging in the streets. And we sucked up everything we could get. We read The White Dwarf. It was a fanzine from England. It was very exciting to have this in special magazines. In special shops, you could buy this stuff. I collected and painted tin miniatures. So it was all this growing with the scene. And we were part of this scene. I think it was very nice. So, but at the age of 20, I stopped, and I was to university, and I restarted. Well, once with some friends, just to introduce them to role-playing game. We made a one-shot. It was, I think, in 2000 and something, and we did what today is called an indie role-playing game. So no rules. They were at the table. I say, okay, here's the situation. What are you going to do? And I introduced rules on the fly. It was very light and it was very story driven.
Oh,
and
that's
I think
cool. Like without the paper part,
without the paper.
Hard role playing.
I gave them the dice when it was necessary and say, now you roll 12 dice. Why 12? Because it's a funny dice. And so it has to be
12s are underused. And
they are.
Yes. And so I introduced them to some of the core concepts of role-playing game, but it was rather story-driven and not so rule-driven. But it was, I think we played 4 times in the year, 3 months, and then we stopped. And they had fun, but they were not hooked, and I did not search for a group. And I restarted 8 years ago, 2014, 13, 14, also with Pathfinder for my son, who it was his 8th or 9th birthday. And I introduced him to the concept of role-playing game because he liked computer games and Nintendo games. And I told him, well, back in the days, I'm from the analog century. We had some fun with games we called role-playing games. Okay, what this? And he knew, I'm not sure if he knew role-playing games from a computer.
A long time ago, I tell you were from this.
I was about to say, like, it sounded like an introduction to witchcraft. Like, at the age of 9, when he finally was old enough.
Yes, when he finally was old enough.
We got initiated into the circle.
There were friends at the table who were pretty scared when the first burning skeleton came. So it was... But I do remember this Columbus effect when I put him in front of the dungeon and said, so what are you going to do? We can do everything we want. Yes, you can do everything. Okay, let's try this out. And they couldn't believe it because they came from board games and from computer games where everything is so limited. And they really had a blast, and I really loved it. But it's time consuming to prepare and keeping a bunch of 10 years old together. But
yes.
This was a nice group because we have occasionally there were some friends coming by because they talked in school, and some rested and some said, oh, it's too complicated, or you have to be concentrated for 3 hours or 5 hours in a row. It's not everybody's cup of tea. And so we had our group, I think, till the pandemic started. So then we had our last session. Also, every 3 months we had something, but it was a very good introduction. And Pathfinder, the first time I introduced them to my old Dnd rules. It was the Red Book. It was very limited. And I didn't realize how limited it was until I replayed it, because in my memories it was so open and everything went fine. But there are so many limitations which have been opened since. And so I thought Pathfinder is very accessible. It's not in the time there was D&D 4th edition, I found it too board gamey with all these miniatures. And so I invested in Pathfinder because I was interested. And it's 1,000-page rules books, 3 books. And I was used to this stuff, but it was, of course, much too much for the 10-year-old. So we boiled it down. The fighting system, the magic system, everything went simpler, and I think we never recovered. We never played the real thing. And I'm glad
I
we
do
did.
like how a lot of us have childhood traumas of like the piano in Super Mario 64, or of the Redeads in Ocarina of Time, and your kids will just have a trauma of flaming skeletons and rules.
Yeah, not the rules. The rules side, I put it, I held it back, and the monsters, there were sometimes a little bit drastic, but I tried to keep them back. But one last anecdote, because when we played in the 80s, it was all about, this is where the youngs are going, and it's dangerous because they are spending more time in the fantasy world than in the real world. Computer games were not even a topic back then. So adults were scared about the fantasy role-playing games more than about video games, I think. So there was a bad thing to do. So it was really geeky. But then when I played 2010 or 2013, when I started, all the parents of the friends of my son were, thank you. He's not playing video games. This is so good. They are doing something where they are talking together. It was like really the best pastime you can imagine for a boy of 10 years old, because they were also spent in their screens. So this was really a cultural change. And when we started to make sessions here, role-playing, pen and paper role-playing sessions, where we looked for a dozen of DMs, and we maybe hosted 10 sessions and 70, 80 persons. There were pretty many students I found who knew the concept, who knew, I once played the Schwarze Auge, or I played this or that, and who really knew what is pen and paper, tabletop pen and paper role-playing games. Because I did remember this was really esoteric stuff. So you talk pen and paper. What is pen and paper? I read about, I heard, but there were nearly nobody with first-hand experiences, and that really changed. Yeah, I think the fact that you're making this live sessions, there's a real culture of analog role-playing game, which I think is also an answer to the sophisticated digital role-playing games and the craving for something not digital.
Yeah, I have to say, like the process you described of like the pen and paper getting a bit more into the mainstream was exactly when I started, and that's what I find a bit funny, because like in the beginning, when I started with like 14, 15, this is like 7-8 years ago, and then it was at the time of like the Big Bang Theory and some other series where you saw like role playing, and it was like exactly the same reaction I had, that some of those we used in the pre-talk we had. We said the pen and paper muggles. Like this, they are all dressed up in those series. It's like they're all dressed up sitting around the table, and it's so geeky and it's so nerdy. And then I have to say, like, what really got me into that is Rocket Beans. I don't know if you know them. Is like a live streaming channel from Germany, and they started playing role-playing games, like a bit different version from the Schwarze Auge. And it was great, because it was like 4 normal dudes, not dressed up, just 4 normal dudes at a table having fun, and that like opened the world up a bit for me. And that's when I started getting invested into pen and paper.
I think it's like that for a lot of people, honestly. So I started, I think, 3 or 4 years before 5e came to become bigger, and clearly came up. And a lot of that is in part to shows like Critical Role and Adventure Zone and that kind of stuff. That there was this entire, like, at least slightly nerdy audience of people that just liked watching people like Markiplier play video games online and that kind of stuff. They're already in that kind of like zone of like watching someone play a game. That through one way or another managed to get in contact with another channel that did RPG stuff. One of the things I still feel that made Critical Role blow up as quickly as it did was because it was a RPG show with professional actors. So when it comes to the story, there's something really to hook yourself into. But on top of that, it was on a channel, Geek and Sundry, which was already a gaming channel that was already known for other things. There's a lot of people that were already interested in just like gaming culture and so on, but also just like basic YouTube stuff that were already in the algorithm in that sense, that got in contact with it through that. Similarly with the McElroy brothers that already had a very big following from a lot of other things, found through their like Adventure Zone podcast, a bunch of people like figuring themselves out like, oh wait, this is cool as well. And I think it was with Adventure Zone as well, so they twisted a lot of rules, so it was for a lot of people to see like, oh, we also don't have to like specifically follow the rules. And a few shows that were already online that were already doing some RPG content, which wasn't big back then yet, started getting more followers as well, due to just the saturation that was happening within the entire community, as it were, because more and more people got like, oh wait, that's that cool thing. I don't have time for that, but something else I was following got into that as well. Like back in a time when Critical Role started going bigger, there was also multiple other channels that did more RPG content, which I wasn't following, but a lot more of the YouTubers that I was following at the time were getting invites to channels like that to come play in a one-shot or something along those lines, which made it very quickly just like crossbreed, cross-pollinate amongst a plethora of like online communities, because almost everyone had at least someone that they were following that was at least part of a one-shot or a short campaign somewhere at some point.
Yeah, how far do you think pen and paper is in the mainstream right now? Like, do you think it is?
There are literally billboards for Critical Role in LA.
Yeah, but I mean, like, are we already like flattening the curve, or is it still going straight up into the mainstream?
I do think there is a large problem with the propagation of role-playing game is the lack of game masters.
Yes.
Because in the younger generations, when I stopped mastering for my children, and when they did not find someone else, they tried it out and they failed in their opinion because it was not so fluent as playing with an experienced game master. And so they were waiting that I said, okay, I have a weekend or I have a Sunday so we can replay. And I think if we have more game masters, it would be a huge success, because it's so, this freedom you can experience in the role-playing game, you have no place elsewhere.
Yeah,
but
that's kind of the difficulty with all of this online stuff taking off, because a lot of that are very experienced GMs that know what they're doing, so people get a very one-sided view of what a D&D game looks like. Most D&D campaigns don't get past their like 8th session, 4th. If you get past your 4th session, you're lucky. The amount of campaigns in RPGs that finish is somewhere in the 0 percentage.
You lucky one. I think I hosted like 16 campaigns, and I think 3 of them got past the first evening.
I've probably
what do you
finished
mean by
one campaign.
What do you mean by campaign? We finished every adventure we did. It took 2 years for a campaign, but well, isn't it finishing because everyone is dying or everyone is fading out?
Because
so
they are like, for me, it's just the usual problem of like you start playing and you don't have like a regular schedule to meet, and then like one week later is like nothing. 1 week later is nothing. 3 weeks later is like, yeah, okay, we can meet again, and then one has to call it off, and then like another 3 weeks later, and so on, and like 2 to 3 months later, it's just, I don't know.
A lot of campaigns bleed out that way. Yeah.
Okay. I never had this experience, to be honest. We had this. Well, there's these convention one-shots lasting 2-3 hours, but it's finished. Everyone is dead, or the story is at an end. But with the campaigns I played, I don't know, the children, they had a very, very precise memory half a year later what happened and what specifically, what situation we left their characters. And no, he wasn't at the right. He's coming from the left, and we already shot him in the back. And I had to take meticulous notes. Yeah, they are very good in continuity. And in the 80s, well, we had nothing else. No, it's not true. But we played, I think, once a week. So we finished everything.
Yeah, I think
only the last campaign we didn't finish because it was the last and never finished.
I think a decent part of the problem here as well is that because we have the sudden propagation of shows where you put people on these amazing things, a lot of us learned to GM just by starting and doing our thing and just figuring it out as we go. Yeah. And that is how you learn to GM, because everyone has their own style. But a lot of people now see GMs that have been doing this for 20, 30 years that are amazing at their craft and have a very specific style that they can maintain. In part also because it's their job. They don't do it besides their job. It is their job.
Yeah, of course they're good at it.
That then have no other experience and think that they should put up something of that quality. Similarly, there's a bunch of players that have never really been in another game and then expect games of the ones that they've seen. But it's very difficult to get a similar kind of game going where you're just with friends instead of when it's a show, because there's a very different buy-in to begin with. But that's... The dichotomy between those two elements that people have, where they see a lot of it happening but have never really experienced it or feel daunted to try and experience it because it's obviously, when you look at some of these online shows, so much work to get something going. And even when you do get it going, they might often attempt to do a style of GMing or playing that isn't in line with how they'd actually like to play, but aren't aware that there's other ways to do it and burn themselves out in the process.
Yeah, like I really feel that, because also what a lot of people don't really recognize is that those game masters are also so good as game masters because the players are really good. In my opinion, it's also a lot of it is also about the players. If you have players that are like not communicating with each other, not like making up their own story, you have a lot more stuff to do as game master that you have to master. And I think it's far easier if like your players take on 50% and they are doing discussions and so on. And sometimes you throw them a breadcrumb to say, maybe you should go that way. And then they play like for 20 minutes without you even having to interfere. And I think that's also like what many people might have a problem with, is when they start game mastering and they want to do it like in the shows, as Wes said, and then they're like at this thing and they're like in the middle of stuff and look around and say, well, you're not acting like the ones in the series. Like I think I know what to do, but why are you not doing something with each other? I think that's also
if there's one thing that this entire talk, or however we want to call this, should bring across to people that watch it, is don't listen to the Wizards of the Coast Dnd Golden Rule. I have one golden rule for you that's way better. You're playing with friends. Have fun. Anything else doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If you just had a shitty last session where everyone died and you all feel like this is no fun, we liked our characters, just retcon the death. You start before the encounter. Something weird happened. We'll figure it out as we go. We don't care. If you want to do something cool, just talk with each other about it. The most important thing is that you're all at a table having fun with each other. You're not a show. You're not online. You don't need to earn money for this. You're just there with your friends to do something fun. If you're playing Minecraft together, you're not on a show. You're just there to have fun with your friends. This is the same. You just have different building blocks.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's an important message here to get across to the people.
And also,
good you said that.
And also, what I always say, just try it. Like,
yeah,
my first DMing session was a disaster in the aftermath. Like, when I look back, it's like, what did I do back then? But it's all right. It was my first time, and slowly you're getting better. And
yeah, it's an ever-learning experience.
Yes, and so just try it, just start it. It won't be as good as your 10th session you host. But you have to start somewhere to get to that 10th session and not like ditch out before because you say, I don't know if I can handle it and so on.
If it's your first time GMing and you just want to do something fun with friends, you don't need to learn all the rules. You can just literally say, everything is a difficulty check 15. Just don't tell your players. So they don't know that you're just putting everything against the 15. And their stats will make sure that some things are more difficult and some things are less difficult. Everything's a 15, just ask them to roll. And if it's a 15 or higher, yay, you did it. If it's a 15 or lower, oh, it didn't work out the way you wanted it to.
Yeah.
And just make up a story. That's all you need to do. And once you get better, you can start looking into like, oh, I can apply different kind of difficulty modifiers here and there. I can start running creatures like this or that. Like even when you're running creatures, their armor class or the challenge to hit them is always 15. And then you can just give yourself a bunch of hatch marks. Like, okay, this is a big creature. It has 6 hatch marks, which means you need to hit it 6 times before it dies. Done. You don't need any of the rules. You don't need any of this bullshit. Just need a D20 and an inspired mind.
And I think you need a certain personality structure to keep a table in check. So, of course, you can say you roll a 15, but you have to be confident that what you are saying is what has to be done. And I think there's the problem. I think many people don't want to master because this is something with authority. And they don't want to be responsible for the evening, which is not the case, but it's the feeling that the DM is responsible, that everything turns out as it has to be. And I think it's more difficult. Of course, if you're an experienced game master, you can always reduce and say, okay, you just use a D6. But if you're new to this and you read the rules, you watch the shows, and you had the wise words of the experienced old game master like you are telling, you just have to have fun and just tell a story. I think it's pretty daunting for a first time. But on the other hand, I don't know first timers of adult age. I'm not sure how they would react today. But when we are hosting our role-playing evenings, it's always the game masters are the scare stuff. There are so many people interested in their first experience, or they did it once a couple of years ago and they want to re-experience it. But the number of game masters is always the limiting factor. And of course, if you are playing Dungeons and Dragons, you forget all the rules, but you have to read the 300 pages beforehand to know what to forget. And it's like... It's like a serpent eating himself. So once you have made the tour, you can forget all the stuff which is too much, but it takes time and experience and courage. And this courage is more difficult to have upfront.
Being a GM is often very similar to being the moderator at a panel.
Yes.
Not with being live or something along those lines, but it's just paying attention to what people are talking about and getting their attention when they're getting off track. That's about all it is. Because you, as a game master, barely have to do any story stuff. You have to have like a few ideas of what's going on. And the rest of it is just waiting for your players to ask you a question and answering it. Often through violence. But no, like, that's all it is just, in a way, it's that whole, like, being a fan of your players. Just they're here to do something. You're there to make it more difficult to do the thing. That's about it.
But not too difficult.
But when you notice that they're getting distracted or going down a tangent, then, well, suddenly orcs attack.
The Deus Ex Machina. Yeah.
There's a few of those very simple dungeon mastering tips, like suddenly orcs attack, everything's a goblin, and zombies are always okay. Which, in this case, to just give a little bit of clarification, suddenly orcs attack doesn't mean that there are actually orcs that attack. It's just whenever your players get distracted or something, you as a GM can just suddenly make something happen to get control back of the situation. And like, okay, guys, I saw that you're all running over there to this chair that is very suspicious to all of you, but it literally has nothing to do with the story. So suddenly some orcs are coming in to go drag you back to where the story is happening. That's all that suddenly orcs attack is.
That's cheating. Yes, of course.
Everything's a goblin means that like you don't need stats for anything.
It's like you can go left or right, but at the left there's a red dragon. So what do you want to do? It's
I was picturing it in my head, and what I would have totally given making the chair a mimic and like hunting them to the place where they have to be.
But that is also a suddenly orcs attack. That's also a suddenly orcs attack.
But
it isn't about it being orcs. It's about you making something happen to get everyone's attention again, to get everyone into action. If you notice that some people are getting bored, for example, that's when you bring suddenly orcs in. So everything's a goblin isn't the fact that everything's actually a goblin, but it's a very fun idea to think of two goblins on top of each other holding like a mask or whatever to try and pose as something else. It's that you can narrate anything looking like anything you want, and if you need stats for it, you can just grab goblin stats. The stats don't have to go align with whatever you're actually running. I can run a weird alien race that has psionic attacks and whatever, and I can just grab a young dragon stats and turn all of the fire stuff into psychic stuff. That's it. Everything's a goblin means that the stats don't have anything to do with what it looks like. You can just put whatever drape you want over whatever you're putting in there. And the zombies one is essentially just anything sentient can be morally weird. This is why everyone loves zombies, because there's no moral complexity to if we can cut down zombies. Sometimes it's just nice to have a good old villain for which it's always okay to just go attack that and murder it.
But more memorable are the ethical, difficult decisions you have to take as a group.
Definitely.
Well, there need to be those.
Very tiresome if that's all what you have.
You need both.
Yes, of course.
You need a good balance of both.
Do you remember the most ethical decision you ever had in your game? Like where your players literally sat down on the table for 15 minutes and were like, what are we doing? Are we going to do A or B? Like, and really started discussing as if their lives were dependent on it.
I have one in my second campaign of this lightweight.
I also have one.
It was something in some kind of imagined world. So they knew they were in an imagined world, and they knew they were their own master of their universe. And what are they going to do? Are they returning into real life in their fantasy real life, or are they staying there? And so this was the first question of blue pill or red pill. And then one player, after a long discussion, decided she left in her realm, but she put an evil food there because she needed the conflict and the confrontation. So she was God, and she created her own devil to have an eternal struggle for good and evil, because if not, it would be so boring. But it was more appealing to her to stay there than going back in the dull life she had in her fantasy world beforehand. So it was a complex decision, and it was, the story was like to put them in this situation to finish it. And we never saw each other again, literally, because we moved. But I'm not sure if she's still in this world or not. And I think it was we had a long discussion afterwards if it's better to live in a world of confrontation or in a boring paradise. And I think this was the most long-term decision. But I had with my children, I had smaller decisions where a paladin started to kill lots of slaves because he needed informations, and after that he lost the status of a paladin, and he was shocked what he was capable of doing. Well, not shocked, but he was surprised when someone who is a newcomer to role-playing and he's doing something awful to maybe even an orc, and seeing he or herself is capable of doing such horrible things they know from the movies. This is really something that can stick with you for a while, because you always thought you are mild-mannered and you solve every conflict by talking yourself out, and then you have a conflict, you have a weapon, and you're not talking a long time. I think this is the nice thing about role-playing games. It puts something up from you. It shows something from you you never knew it were there. And sometimes you can play with that and say, today I will be the supervillain. But if it's the first time, and you have this role-playing experience, and it's not the dice deciding, but you decide to do this, and you don't have either you kill it or you are going to die. Well, this is self-defense, but you can try to find another way, but it's so easy to do the evil way, or the evil, something you find morally disgusting in a normal situation. Yeah. I think this is very fascinating how people react when confronted with their own inner shadow.
Like, I don't want to think about how many sadistic people are, like how many people get to be torture masters if they are in a pen and paper.
And then the mere goblin or the orc, which of course can be something like cannon fodder, if he has a voice and if he has a family or if he has desires and needs and back history, why is he here and trying to steal your stuff, is something like not a human, but it's like a living being. And you have to invest yourself. Is it just one of many or is it someone? And how do we deal with something that has a name? And I think this is, of course, if it's always like this, it would be too stressful, but it's spicing up every campaign when you kill them by the dozen and the 13th one has a name. So this is because you kept him alive and you see, well, you have to deal with the prisoner. It's not the same thing as dealing with the stat. And so this creates memories. They are talking about these moments till today, years after. But the dozens of elementers and rats and slimes, well, they have just gotten into their experience points. And I think they might remember, but it's not something that confronted them with their inner self. And this is what role-playing is.
This is why I tend to either make enemies, if I don't want to bring in like morality, I either make them aliens, as it were, just most of the time in D&D's case, aberrations. So weird, mean green aliens from outer space that are incorrigible in their ways, for their minds are so different from ours that we can't really connect to them anyway. Or I try to make them something like undead or cursed beings, where the act of killing them is generally, in a way, either graceful or always in the betterment of everyone around you, not just because of an indulgence. That isn't to say that you can't do anything with that. That's very interesting. I think one of the most recent moral quandaries in the game that I've run was my party was sneaking through the headquarters of a large UNT base, as it were. And those UNT had connections with Nyogi, which are aberrations that can dominate people to do the whole mind flayer enslavement thing, whatever. So they were sneaking about, and they shouldn't get caught no matter what. So the four of them managed to get to a point where the UNT and the Nyogi were handling prisoners that were being brought off to the Nyogi to go out into outer space and wherever they go. And one of those prisoners was the nephew of one of the players, one of the player characters. So either they stay silent and finish their mission to save the world from this curse that's happening, or they have to go start a fight with a bunch of creatures that are very difficult to beat and where there's a lot of them. Which at this point they were also level 10, so it was fair to make it a bit of a bigger challenge, but still. But that brings in the whole it's entirely okay to kill them because they're weird alien things that are terrible, terrible beings of pure evil. But also, doing so is going to bring that one thing you're doing to try to save the world into danger, because you might not survive. But if you don't do it now, you will lose this character forever because they're going off into the wild, wild beyonds. So, yeah. They ended up fighting them, by the way.
Yeah, of course.
It was a whole big mess, but yes.
Of course they did.
You used your steel dice and they won?
That was an online session, so I was using the online dice roller, but I did make sure to make the domination perk that the Nyogi have a little bit less mean. Because normally it's if you fail a save, then you are just under their control for the rest of the day, without any other saves or whatever. Which is real mean when you got a boatload of them.
Yeah.
That is harsh.
That's why we don't roll dice in public. Was the first rule I
do like rolling dice in public because it does.
I don't.
See, the thing is, if you roll dice behind the screen, and there is this element of antagonism that you sometimes need to deal with between you and your players. While if you show them the dice, they know nope, this is just how the dice rolled. That's nothing that my GM did or whatever. But there has always been this wild debate on whether or not to keep your dice secret and what to do with your dice when that happens. I think if we start that, that's all we're going to be talking about for the rest of the session.
Mm-hmm. I liked it in the Star Wars, the Star Wars role-playing series, where you roll multiple dice and it's favorable, it's unfavorable.
I love their dice system.
Yeah, that's
for people that don't know,
I roll in public, but the others in D&D or Pathfinder I roll in private.
For people that don't know, the Star Wars system has a dice pool system where you collect multiple dice depending on how difficult it is, and on them are blanks, a success, a great success, or a failure, or a terrible failure, I believe, in different quantities. And your GM can, for example, give you 2 red dice because it's something very difficult to add to your pool. And at the end of it, when you've added all your dice pool collection together, you roll them and you count all the successes. And because they also come from specific dices, so some of them come from your skill, some of them come from scenario, context, or whatever, you can also use whatever you rolled, kind of like reading the bones to kind of like create a narrative of what is happening.
That's very interesting. That's a
really cool dice system.
It's
the problem is you need to go get yourself some custom dice.
or an app or an online app, but the dice it's so good. It feels so good to just rolling at 10 dice. It's very, very
physical dice rolling is,
and you have to deal with everything. So you can have a success, but you have to deal with a failure. So you have to negotiate what this failure could be, or you can fail, but you have some success in it. And so your GM can give you a favor next time. You can even spare it up. You can put it beside, and the next time you need a favor from your DM, you're telling, well, I was lucky the last time. You remember I have a token that told me so. So you have to, and so you're really inventing the story with the help of the dice. I really love this one. Yes.
Christoph, how about we get us back on track? As I believe we're going into territory that's already like intermediate instead of beginner. I thought we were gonna like grow into that.
Yeah, but I don't want to like disrupt you, because you're really.
It is interesting, yeah.
Really is.
But beginner, has anyone explained what a DM is or a GM for the beginner?
Now after 40 minutes talks,
or is this 2101? Because
I think I'm gonna like do a bit of like it will be a video in the end, and I record like a small 2-minute pre-explanation for all the things.
Put it in the introduction, okay?
Like a glossary where we get all the terms explained beforehand.
Yeah. Then let's get us back on track with a bit of, like, as I said, with a bit of personal experience. Do you remember the first death in one of your campaigns? And like, how did he die, or how difficult for you was it to tell the player that he died? Like, he is really dead now, not just severely injured and can be saved and brought to a hospital or something, but his character is now gone.
See, I'm a monger well accustomed to death. I deal death swiftly if need be. No, a little bit more serious. This is one of those things where, like I just said, I tend to roll my dice out in the open, which also means that your kill count is going to be higher, because sometimes the dice just do not like your players. Sometimes you just roll 3 crits in a row, and the dice are there, and that's what happens. The very first time I had a character die on my watch was kind of near the end of a campaign. More because I was moving to Germany a few weeks later, and was a bit difficult to keep that up.
To get rid of
so
some friends.
Yeah, I think we had 2 sessions after that. But that was a pretty big moment, because it was for almost everyone the first time that there was an actual, like, real big character death. Because the first few sessions I was in, there was a player in. We had a GM that, needless to say, we never got past level 4. They very quickly either hopped to a different campaign, so you never really got invested into your characters, or they were against insurmountable odds and died relatively quickly. But that was the first time after, like, a campaign that ran for 2.5 years or something, that we actually lost the character. And Yeah, that was something that took essentially the latter half of an entire session. They died the session before, near the end. That's like, okay, let's call it quits here for now. Tried to resurrect, and I did have some rules where resurrection doesn't always work. And we rolled, and it was a bad roll. Coincidentally, this is where I learned to not trust my metal dice, because they don't roll high. I didn't know that yet.
Well, then you knew.
But yeah, we... for a lot of people, it isn't as big as it is with shows like Critical Role, but there's still time spent with that character, and that does give it some impact. And while it is less like grieving for an actual person in many ways, there is that moment of like, there was something fun that is gone now, and it's important to give that a little bit of room, a little bit of space. And one of the things I like to do if I can is to take that character death and bring that forwards into the story. I have one real fun story about how a level 1 character death turned into what became the big bad evil guy of one of the campaign that I finished. But I'll let Jochen talk first about their experiences with this.
Before we let Mr. Kubek talk, I would like to know and give like a quick morning second at least to who was that character that departed from your fantasy world. If you remember,
that was Borat the Ranger. That was level 6 at that point, and they got mauled by a slightly out of hand, powerful wooden golem.
Sounds painful.
This is the thing with D&D. Not D&D, just RPGs, is all of your encounters are playtesting. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you did a bad design.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a tiny room with a very big rampaging golem. It did a lot of damage. And then we had it.
Well, in the 80s, when we made our campaign, we were very strict by the rules, and we encountered pretty early, if you kill or if you lose one member of the party and the others are level 3 or 4, he has to recreate a character, which takes easily half or a good part of an hour, and he will start at level 1. So the whole party is imbalanced. It was not a good experience. So better kill them all or let them start over again, but not take the level 1 wizard with them. He's even weaker than the other wizards. So that's one reason we kept rolling our dice in private but the question is, how do you keep the menace up that eventually you will kill them if they are too stupid? And that's maybe the most memorable moment with the child's group, because boys at the age of 10 they want to know their limits, and there was one player who didn't trust me. So there was this campaign, they approached the final boss and they opened the door too early because they were ill prepared, they have not slept, they were not well equipped. And so everybody fled, but one stayed. He said, no, I will confront them. I said, you're sure? Yes, I'm sure. No, get going. And he closed the door and he confronted both enemies in the final encounter. And then I had no chance to save him. I told him,
You foul enemy! You shall die by my sword!
Yes.
It was an heroic act, though.
It was a heroic act, and he was baffled that I really went this far, and we took the character out. We talked about
heroism
this.
and stupidity are often very closely aligned.
Yes,
They are.
And I think he wanted to know if I'm serious. And at this time, after he took the game serious, he took my DMing more serious, and they were every time afraid that the situation would, because I was shown capable of killing my characters or of the characters of my players. And I had no problem with authority since. So I think it was I knew this would happen, but it's always tragic to lose a character you spend a couple of weeks with, and he is already level 2 at the edge of level 3, and you have to restart from scratch. But this was, I think, the most memorable death in one of my parties. If you're playing something like Cthulhu, where you start with 4 characters and you lose 2 or 3 of them, I think it's more, you knew it will happen. Either death or they are mad.
Yes.
But if you are really fostering some of your characters and you're spending, well, in our campaign, we spent 5 years with a character. He was level 16. You don't want to lose a level 16 character after 5 years of regular playing. And so, and the GM rule books were talking about level 40. We never saw this near, even from the far side, because we were, well, it took our time. We were meant to spend the rest of our life in this campaign. And so death is nothing you easily enjoy when you're young. And when you think the character is yours, and maybe with the elders, when you're a little bit older, or when you know this will last, well, 3 evenings and you lose in the second, it's more like a board game death. So it's not really problematic. But when you're really attached to your character and it's part of being you, it's showing something you ever wanted to be, you don't take this away from a player easily. That's why I roll in private.
And to come back then a little bit on that, because like I said, I don't roll in private generally. But that's also because there's one thing I keep in mind with that as well. It is not about death, it's about consequence. Yes. If you have characters that are highly invested into their characters, you don't have to kill them at all. It's about the consequence of what happens when you get into a fail state. It's way more like designy in that sense. But if you play with people that are invested in the characters and would hate to see them die, you talk with your players about that beforehand, where their like interests are and where their boundaries are. But it's not about killing them. It's about giving them consequences. It's about making sure that after that killing blow has been had, that something happens. That something can just be, okay, the next quest is to bring them back alive and go find a genie that we can wish to survive them, whatever. That can also be... they continue on playing as the ghost of themselves currently, that is following the party, that they have a way to communicate with. That can also just be you've been into the good graces of some immensely powerful being and they bring you back alive, but now you owe them a favor. There is a myriad of ways how to circumvent death, as it were, without removing the consequence of death. And that is the most important part, is that consequence is there, because that's what makes it feel real.
Yes, they're right. But that wasn't in the rules, and we weren't creative enough to tell, okay, that's our take on this rule set. Yeah. But of course, you have to be more creative if you want to let them continue their play.
D&D and Pathfinder both have this problem where they have plenty of rules, but they have no sections dedicated to actually explaining how to GM. Despite having an entire book,
yes, of course,
called the Dungeon Master's Guide, none of this has proper it has a bunch of interesting stuff to like do some world building and like set up some basics, but actual teaching you how to GM.
I think I brought the question up because I'm like a bit, let's say a bit shaken, because I never killed a character because I don't like it, especially if you're a few evenings in. It's like there's relationships building between characters. They are slowly finding their way. And as a player, I got killed once where we played a normal like fantasy pen and paper, just the regular stuff based on the Schwarze Auge. And then, and it was all very in the world of, I don't know, Walter Mörs. And it was really great, and it was a bit lightweight, but there was a rule: if your hit points go below 0 or 0 or below, you roll a d6. 1 or 2 you die, 3 or 4 you're disfigured, 5 or 6 nothing happens. And I rolled badly, and I was really, really mad at this evening, because I was like, it was like the 3rd or 4th evening, I think, a session. And we got to know each other, like slowly. There was a group dynamic building up, and suddenly I was dead. And that's where I learned, like, it was like in the middle, let's say, of my game master career. And that's where I got reinforced with the idea to never let a character die.
Yeah, but you will remember this moment for the rest of your life and not the other evenings.
Yeah, but I don't know.
I think it's a
for the
stupid rule. I think this is it's so American. You take a decision after you let the dice decide if it's successful or not. But I think what Wes said is so true. It's about consequences.
Yeah.
If the dice is telling the consequence, that's a bad feeling. But if a player is behaving too stupid or not caring enough about his character, you must be capable of letting them die to know that you are going this far with resurrection or without. But I also think you have to try to avoid this as far as possible. But if they are not taking you serious as someone who is living the consequence of his own world, all the game becomes stale. But letting a dice decide if you live or die, this is, I think it's gambling. It's bad gambling. But if you take the consequence of bad caring about the character, maybe it's a one shot. It's a guest who's saying, well, what's all this about? I'm just going in this room. There's noise back. Of course, I'm opening the door. But then you show others and this person, this is a serious world and he can start over again. So this is really a tough call for game master, but you have to be prepared to let someone die if he deserves it in the game logic.
Sure.
Not if the dice.
Yeah. I never liked the term deserve. Like what I like there's some newer games, like Blades in the Dark, for example, that have an amazing system with this, where Blades in the Dark doesn't say like you can die in Blades in the Dark. There is a rule where you specifically die. You need to try so hard to get there. That's not the thing that will normally happen. What will normally happen is you can get a 3rd level wound. Those are critical. Those can kill you if not taken care of. But whenever you get one of those, or whenever you stress out, the rules say you are taken out of the scene. And we can discuss what that looks like. Mm-hmm. Similarly, there is also games that have a point, for example, I believe even Pathfinder 2nd Edition does this as well, is if you die, you can spend all your hero points and you will not die. You will be out of the scene. Something needs to be taken care of to make sure that you don't actually die. But you've been grabbed before you actually die, and you've survived this encounter. Ways to make sure that death doesn't have to be permanent, but that the consequence is still there. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's about making sure that there's this sense of verisimilitude by including a sense of danger. And you can't do that without having any consequences there. Be it death or something else doesn't really matter. This is a fantasy game. We have infinite possibilities to do something upon death that isn't death. Some people like to play their games like they're playing Iron mode in a game, so that if they die, the save is lost and you have to try again. Some people treasure that one character they go through with everything, and you will often notice that if they do have to make a new character, they'll make the same character anyway, but with a different name. So you might as well accommodate them and make sure that they have fun. Because the whole point of death, just look at series on television or whatever, the whole point of death is if you put in death, you are completely crossing out whatever impact, whatever drama, whatever element that character could bring into the story. So whatever it brings through its death in drama and character arcs and like interesting elements to all the other characters must be worth it for that character to die. It must bring more in that way. Otherwise, there's no real reason to let the character die. Just do something else. This is where character death can be interesting. If you have players that are okay with character death and that is a long-lasting character, this is where someone can come in playing the long-lost brother of this character, trying to come back alive. Where they might have at some point, maybe you're like level 12 or higher, and you might have actually had like a noble position somewhere and need to take care of a dukedom that is now starting to fall to ruins because the duke is dead and there was no heir. These are interesting things that can come from character death if everyone's aboard with that happening. But if there's nothing interesting coming out of that death except for the punishment that someone wasn't paying attention, or worse, the punishment for the dice not being with you with that day, don't let that death happen. if players choose for their characters to die, that is fine. I've had characters die as well, where I'm like, yo, our group is in a shitty situation. I'm near death. Can I heroically sacrifice my character?
Yeah.
I've done heroic sacrifices. Like, hey, DM, I'd like to break the rules entirely and take care of this one threat, but I'll die in doing so that my friends will survive. And that's an interesting way for me to be like, okay, there are threads that my character will leave behind, but those are interesting for my players to be like, okay, how are we going to deal with that after I'm gone? But the death itself will have had an impact, and I was on board with it as well, which is a very big part of this, to bring more drama and tension into the narrative.
Yeah.
What we did when the paladin lost his power, this was nearly a death, because no magic, no special abilities, just a not so good fighter at all. We spent another campaign to get him reborn as a demon hunter. So he was an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old starting as rightful good, of course, because you're with the white head. And he made it clear that rightful good is the most boring constitution you can have in the world. So he didn't behave but the paladin needs to be. So he lost it, and he was very, very happy with his new role as a demon hunter, which he had to earn. The whole party had to earn. And then his loss was something he took with him his whole adolescence, that maybe rightful good is not the best moral you can have in a fantasy world. And I think this is something you can sometimes do if you're not adhering too much to the rules, when you take death as something either ephemeral, or we didn't think of this. If you let a level 5 character die, you don't necessarily have to restart as level 1. This is the idea what Wes told. You can be the brother or someone else who is level 4. And so you can go back to the game. You have a decent equipment. You have a decent backstory. And that's not so bad, because starting all over again where you're so weak, this is what bugs most people out. But if you can start a little bit higher, I think it's not even considered unjust if it's a little less than before. And so everybody's happy to have a new member in the crew. This is also a possibility.
And I'd like to very quickly, by the way, turn this on its head as well. Death must have consequence. That consequence doesn't have to be death. But it also means if you look at base 5e D&D, you have to probably put in there a little bit more than just a diamond they have to burn to bring them back. Because it's rather inconsequential past level 5 in D&D 5e.
Yes. I heard that a lot of times, actually.
Yeah. Well, that brings us back to the point, as we said earlier, and that's the saying we have in my group we play as well. Like, it's called a rule book, but it's more like their guidelines. Like,
yeah, I just never liked the golden rule that Wizards of the Coast tends to put into their book, because it always reads more in that book of we made these rules, but if you don't like them, that's your fault. Just change them yourself instead of taking onus on to the book that they've written. No,
that reads really harshly. But still, you can adjust the way that it's fun and meaningful for everybody.
The world is your oyster, and this game is all for you to play around with.
Yeah,
do whatever you want with it.
But that brings me to
real quickly go through that story that I wanted to tell about the level 1 character death that brought the big bad evil guy.
Sure.
So I finished one campaign. The rest of them were all campaigns that never got finished for whatever reason. But I finished one campaign which went from level 1 to level 14. And at level 1, we had a warlock whose warlock patron was essentially Odin, but a little bit weird and warped, because it was literally like Odin from our universe trying to connect through the whatever barriers between worlds and whatever. And their eldritch focus was their hat. And the night before they died, due to just a bad random encounter, the rogue of our party pulled a prank on the warlock by taking away the hat and putting it on. So I had this malevolent version of Odin take hold within the rogue and start teasing hey, you want some powers? You want some powers? I can help you with this. And eventually even got that far that the rogue accepted it once for, I don't even know the reason why they accepted it anymore. I think I'd lose some dinosaurs into a crowd, which made him like, shit, I need power now. But that was like until level 7 or level 8, where they met with an angelic being, where the rogue could purge themselves of the essence of Odin that was within them and growing within them. Not before the rogue had mind melded with the monk at that point, though. So had left a trace of Odin within the monk. To the point where at some point, and obviously like this as a bad guy had grown over time, and the original bad guy was going to be like some lich guy that was never going to really show up until the end anyway. But every time it swapped minds, it like grew up a little bit more and became more part of this world, so it became more integrated and had a better performance out to other people, so to say. Monks being monk, though, very stubborn, didn't want to take the gifted power in trade for some corruption, so to say. But the monk then got stuck in a bad position, where Odin was like, "Hey, you're gonna die here. Do you want to die here? Here, have a power, or this power, or that power. All of them can get you out of here." And the monk was like, "No, I will not take your powers. I will not be corrupted." And well, then the character died. Meaning that the spirit of Odin that was in there could now take over the body, since the other spirit was dead. Of course. Turning essentially into what then, throughout their entire adventures, the rogue and the other compatriots would from time to time meet this reincarnation of Odin again every time when they got closer to a power source or something along those lines, as Odin kept growing in power. And they often got in situations where they're like, shit, this bad guy is right in front of a like magical well of power, but we're dealing with a bunch of other stuff right now and we can't take care of that, so now they're going to be even more powerful. Till at some point at the second to last session, when they were fighting what was originally going to be the big bad evil guy, I made Odin come in and just in one punch out the heart of the big bad evil guy and just dissolve them, turning them into the new big bad evil guy.
Even bigger, even better, and even eviler.
Because Odin had been with them since session 1, had been a part of this entire thing, constantly coming back over and over again. So at some point, I think 20 or 30 sessions before the end, when the end was coming, like, this is not the big bad evil guy anymore. I've got Odin now. But that all came from a single character death.
Yeah.
Bringing that over and over for multiple character deaths even. Making sure, because the whole point was to show that even if your characters are dead, they can still have an influence on your game in that sense.
Yeah.
Because it was because of the notable, like, it was the monk that died, which made this end boss a real bitch to deal with. Because I accidentally gave the monk, through a random loot roll, a rope displacement, which means you have this advantage at hitting them until you hit them. So now my big bad evil guy hit a rope of displacement monk.
Nice.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, like, I did a lot of things on the design of that of Odin to make sure that they're an interesting boss that is still capable of being dealt with, because I knew they were barely going to hit them. So I made sure that the boss had very low HP, so that a few times they hit them, it counts, that kind of stuff. But it brought so much more to the world to know that their characters, even those that died, have had an influence on where this story went.
Yes. We're running kind of out of time for this section. I just have a few more questions and just try to answer it in one sentence or a few words. Yes, we have a bit of time left, but not. Mm-hmm. But there are some questions I think
lightning round
might be interesting. Okay, we start with Jochen, then Wes, then Vincent, and then me. Okay.
Sure.
Go ahead.
With the questions. Okay. What is your favorite class?
I always like the rogues, but they never play really well. So, mage. I like the mages starting weak and getting overpowered in D&D.
Wes?
Which RPG?
just like in general, like what do you think is the most fun to play, or the coolest idea of a of a class?
I could say anything but Bard, but I'd be lying.
Well,
I think Bards are real well made, and they're a ton of fun to play, and you can do anything with them.
Okay, for me it's probably I have to go with Rogues, I think, probably, but because it's my longest played character. But I like to multi-class them into something fun, like a Rogue Sorcerer or something.
Yeah, I have to say, like my best like character is always like a Warlock, some not entirely evil guy, but shifted into like a bit more evil, and the patron is telling you stuff to do, and that makes it a lot easier for me to be evil, because I can say, this guy told me to be evil. I wouldn't be that evil, but that guy told me to be evil.
Wasn't me, nuh-uh.
But I have to admit, the last time I played, my favorite class was an elf, because in D&D in this time there was no distinction between race and class, and so I chose
probably be a dwarf then.
I chose the elf because he was fighter and mage, and I never thought I would go past level 7 where they parted. So it was the best of both worlds, and I understood how restrained this is when I looked at Pathfinder and modern role-playing games where there's a clear distinction between race and class. And so I like the mage in our group, but I haven't played since. I think the last time I played was with you, the last time we had this live role-playing experience. I'm always DMing, and so I'm not sure what's my favorite class to play, because it's been 30 years.
That's fair enough.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite?
That elf was a class was the time that wizards were truly quadratic against the linear fighters.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite NPC, and what's his or her voice? A favorite NPC, like yes. For example, I give an example. I just start with this question. I always like my favorite NPCs to play to DM are always those shady guys, those like, I can offer you a deal, but you have to do something in return for that. like those guys, and those are always my favorite NPCs, like the back alley gangsters or something, someone who has something the players want, but also has some shady deals.
Yeah, but I appreciate this, but I think I like even more when that's not so obviously shady. So someone who's either on your side but isn't secretly, or either is your enemy and helping you in the end. Some NPCs really surprising the players, and they are kept off guard in either direction, or who is boring but finally turns out to be more interesting, or the other way around. I think this would be my favorite NPCs.
My answer is going to be a little bit twofold. I have a character trope that I always bring back, which is the big, beefy, retired adventurer barkeep. Like my Twitch is also like Carousing Bear Tavern. Like I have a bunch of stuff with that. That's always like, I've had that since session 1, and that will come back in every single campaign I run.
Well, there's always a little bit of the bigger gruff type, just talking with you about how your day's going.
Or they're a little bit more flamboyant and they have a great time with it. Either one of those two, but they're still big, beefy dudes and they know how to punch your face in. The other one is whenever you turn something that used to be a monster into a creature, a.k.a.
I'm Snuggletooth. I used to be a Comet-headed, but now I'm a Comet-11 because I have a hat.
That has happens too often, and it's always fun, and all my players always love it. So,
well, favorite NPCs. I think I have to go along with all of what you said before. I love my shady characters, but most favorite was probably the shady character in noble design, so to speak. Acting all nice and then stabbing you in the back most of the time. But afraid I don't have any fun character voice because I'm still writing on my campaign I'm planning to play, so I don't have any voices yet ready. But
hey, this is the GM thing. 9 times out of 10, your voices have to come out right on the spot. So bring them on.
Oh boy! Oh, don't put me. Why would you put me on the spot like that, Wes? What's that?
Because as I've told you before, this is how GMs do.
That is a fair call.
It's the best way to learn, darling.
Then let's get a bit away from like personal experience and stuff and more into like we did that a bit in the first part, but more in the world building aspect and the planning of campaigns. Like, the first question is, how do you build your worlds? Top down or bottom up? Like, Vincent maybe can explain this a bit better for the viewer.
Yeah. As I wrote down the question, by that I mostly meant, do you start with like a general big concept, a big idea of a world, what it's supposed to be, and then slowly work your way inward into the details, or that would be top down, or do you work bottom up, like from a small detail, from like a small just an ember of a thought that flickers into your mind, a small detail, and then from that you start to build out your world, add up things, get more ideas, and then let it grow, so to speak.
Turn the ember into a wildfire.
So to speak, yes.
Especially in my case, my advice is going to be near opposite from what I do, because I'm a perfectionist. Generally, what I advise to people is, if you're doing a one-shot or a short campaign, just make a town, give it a name, give it 4 or 5 important people, and just put a few things around it that are interesting to do for people, and you'll figure it out from there. And if this is a thing where you are going to run small campaigns or one-shots for that group more often, then you can basically just keep a little binder with the things that you've made before and just add to those, and your world will start to expand itself automatically over time. If you're planning a bit of a bigger campaign, or you're planning to actually like create a setting of your own and homebrewing that, what I suggest is take the first 5% of the work you put in to look at a bigger scope. If you have a specific theme you want to like work into your story, if you have a specific feel that you want to bring across, that kind of stuff, work that out from the start. And with that, you can set just a few of the like historical events that might have happened, and a few of the bigger things that might have happened. And once you've done that, like first week of work, so to say, you set that aside. And then you just make the town, just like with a one-shot, and you make the little surroundings and whatever, so you can have people start playing your game. Because what otherwise is going to happen is you're going to get caught into prep hell, and you're never going to run because you're still prepping. Just make sure you've got the big idea, so you know where to go when you need to make something up on the spot. And then just start small and build it out over time. Because they're going to go from town to town to town. So you're going to start creating multiple towns anyway. As long as you have an idea of like, okay, up to the north is the cold place, and up to the south is where the warm place is, and then like you'll figure it out. But you do want to make sure that you at least have this general scope of what your world is going to be before you start out with, because that's what's going to help you decide what is going to be where and what's going to be what.
Oh, that makes me happy. That means I'm on a good road. I mean, I have a bit more of details so far in, but that's mostly because I'm in the backlog for my group I'm playing with. So I have the time, but I could start any time at any kind of place. And I'm just using
like I said, I'm a perfectionist.
Lodge in some more details.
I'm a perfectionist. I was gonna make a pantheon, and then I was like, wait, but before I can build a pantheon, I need to know how the world was made. How did this universe come into being?
That's how I started working, and then I was like, okay, I'm never gonna get anything done if I do it like that.
I have another proposition for the parents among us. Because back then I was very map driven. I started to paint the map of the whole Middle Earth like world, and did what Wes said. So when I had a large impression what the world would look like, and when something plays here, it would be sketched out on the fly or in the preparation of this particular adventure. But since I have less time and more money, I'm just buying my world. So when I got into Pathfinder, I had no problem buying the world set of Golarion plus the maps plus the special rule set for this region where this adventure will take place. And I spent time reading and preparing, and I have all the information needed. And it existed in the 80s. We had Greyhawk, I think, the world, but it was not available in Germany. It has been around in the White Dwarf. We read about this, several worlds and the Forgotten Realms. And it was, at this time, sound like cheating. You don't buy a world, you create it yourself. But since but so many fantasy worlds turned out to be a carbon copy of Middle Earth, maybe it's not so creative just to find different names for your realm of evil and the small folks living in the Northwest. So you can buy your world, or you take it from the internet. There are so many worlds open. And Golarion had the adventures. So even the adventures, we took the adventures. I bought them in the fantasy store. It's the Demon Hunter quest. I had to take dust from my world building skills because it hasn't been there wasn't a campaign from this. But I think my campaigns are not better than the board ones. They might be sometimes good, sometimes not good. And I spent more evenings reading this or that aspect, preparing the voices, preparing the stats, and then we had lots of fun.
Yeah, if you can make it work to just do pre-made and it's affordable for you, go ahead. Like, I've tried it. I know that I am too wild with my imagination to hold myself to any preset location. But especially for people that are just starting out and aren't that great at like doing all of this themselves yet and don't really know what they're doing, it's amazing to just start with a setting and with an adventure, and from there you can start to find the things where you're better at. Sorry for the fireworks, it's almost the end of December. You can start to find the things that you're more comfortable with and the things that you like and the things that you want to change, etc. To be a little bit more constructive with what I just said about do the 5% like top-down work, I don't mean per se map. Like, that can be a part of it, so you know where your regions are and how many regions you have. But it could also be like the theme of this this campaign is that monsters are made, not like born or something along those lines, where you're really working into that like morality of what is and isn't a monster, and where often monsters might be better people than some of the people you're meeting. Like Witcher does a lot of that, for example. Theme can also be just dark fantasy. So it's about like figuring out, okay, what kind of story do you want to tell? Write maybe 2 or 3 basic themes down from that. From there, think about what major changes will bring this to my world. Is magic still a thing, for example? If magic is a thing, and how far is that going to be a thing? What limiters might be there? And don't go into details on that. Just write down the first 2 or 3 things that you come across in your brain whenever you think of that, because you can expand on it later. That's not the point. Then just imagine 2 or 3 things that happened in the past of your world that have informed why the world is where it is now. Maybe a giant war happened, or maybe the magic broke or whatever. And then imagine 2 or 3 factions within that have some goals. That is going to be most of the reasons where your quests are coming from, the story you're trying to tell, and maybe come up with 2 or 3 things that they want to do and are going to do if the players don't stop that. From there, you can stop whatever like big world prep thing you're doing. That's where you're going to go small and start with a little village and whatever. But just so you have the basic idea of like, this is the basic story structure of whatever story and world I want to showcase and tell. And from there on, we can slowly introduce more things. Especially, because most of that stuff is going to come into play when they're like level 8 and beyond. It's not going to come into play much at the start. And everything that they're doing at the start, you can often afterwards retangle back into the plot. Oh, it was happening because of such and so we're doing this and that. Definitely. Always in the plans. But the best thing about just having a small little thing as something to play is your players are just as much a part of telling the narrative and building the world as you are. They have a family. That family is from somewhere. Now you have a new place and a place name you can just plonk down somewhere. They have an arch enemy that they try to fight over. Like, okay, cool. Now we have a new faction that is up to something in the world, etc. Your players are going to bring so much to your world and to your world building that it's a waste not to bring them in as soon as possible.
Depends on the players.
Depends on the players, but most of the groups will at least have one or two of those players at the table.
Yeah, a bit to that. What do you think about self-building worlds? Where you like start out with a rough idea, and then you get in, and then your players get to decide with you, and they're like, "Yeah, in this world, like I get my 6-legged horse, and from then on, all horses in this world are 6-legged." Or I come from this place up north, and it is surrounded by a giant firewall, and
sure.
You need a good memory and a good notebook, but I think it's a good idea if it's consistent.
Which is honestly what you already need to GM anyway.
Yeah, but the difference if you have to take care of a single adventure or a single campaign or a whole world.
For sure.
Or you have a good note-taking player.
Pardon?
Or you have a good note-taking player that writes down everything anyways, and you can just talk to them.
Last month you said it was... Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's me.
Well, but that's the thing.
I'm honest.
If you're the GM, you don't have to do everything yourself. You don't have to know all the rules. Someone else can know all the rules.
Yes.
And then you can just ask them, like, how did that work again? You don't have to take all the notes. Someone else can take all the notes. And just look at what you have at your table and what the people are interested in doing. Yeah, because most of the time there will already be someone that knows the rules real well. There will already be someone that knows like how to take notes real well, and there might already be someone that's real good at like being imaginative and bringing in new ideas when you don't know what bad thing is going to happen or good thing's going to happen, and you can just open it up to the players.
That's perhaps like another ground rule you can draw. Like the game master is one of the players. He just has a different position. Yeah, he's not there to entertain you the entire evening, and he is one of the group, and he's meant to have fun as well. And you as a player or you as a game master should always be remembered of that. And if you're as a game master having the feeling of I'm doing a lot of stuff and actually it's kind of getting a bit too much, you can also get to players and say, hey, can you take this responsibility? Would be nice, because like you're not the teacher in front or everything that is meant to be there and do all this stuff, but you're just one of the guys at the table who wants to have fun.
If I can put my perspective, because I only have experience to playing with youngs, with adults, not adults, it's between 10 and 20. Because in the time I was in this age, and today I'm playing mostly with kids or with students who the first time for their life are playing a role-playing game. I think this really demands experienced players with this kind of fantasy and this kind of, well, I am creating my world, when they are coping with the basic mechanics or really adhering to some rules. I think this is a very fascinating idea to let the players create your world, but most times I did not run very well with them to decide what to do. They need to be much more guided. It's like in a seminar, because I learned so much from role-playing games to, being a teacher at university level. It's like in a seminar, if you don't know as the teacher where you want the class to be, the class don't know either. There might be some who have an idea where they want to be, but it's rarely appropriate for the rest of all. And I think when I started not creating a world, because I'm not world building, but when I'm creating an adventure or a campaign which will last for one evening or 3 or 4, I'm always starting at the end. what is the great moment at the end I want them to be, and why this surprising, and what will they discover? And then I can come with events taking place beforehand, because they will all show up in the end. And this is how I prepare my classrooms also. What is the goals I want to achieve, and how can we get there? But I think what you're describing is not the architect, but the gardening way of telling a story. I really appreciate. I had this once in a role-playing session where it was a Star Wars role-playing, where it really turned out to be emergent, because they didn't behave like the adventure foresee, and we have to improvise. It was one of my fondest memories as the game master, because it really turned out well. The dice were very good, and the story arcs were all very nice. And I think this is something you need experienced players, because with my children groups, we never had this, where the group decided to do something was not foreseen. Because if you are in a bar and, you have a bartender, of course, he will give you, either he or someone gives you adventure. And there's in the book, what do you do if the group does not want to take this adventure? I never encountered this moment. Of course, they are eager in the village. Who's giving me the quest I have to do? And so dealing with players who are, you have their own mind and their own idea of what they want to achieve in this world, I think it's a fascinating experience, but needs either a certain age or a certain experience with the systems.
It often, in my experience, it really depends on the player type in part, but it's also about scope. A lot of times when your players will come to you with ideas, they are small, but they can have a huge impact if you let them. But especially since as GMs we're often busy, or we have a pre-made adventure and that kind of stuff, and it's very easy to kind of, not on purpose, but kind of shoot them down, and that often gets people to like not suggest things too often anymore, especially since there's already this idea that as a GM, you're the one that makes the world. You're the one that tells what is true and what is not. There's this very like opposite view of what people's like power is within this relationship, as it were. I always love just finding those small little things, like a character thinks they can speak that language. I myself once had a character that could speak Aquan and Terran, so the languages of water and of the earth, so to say. So I told my GMs, like, what if I can talk to trees? It just takes real long, because the trees, they don't talk fast, but what if I can talk with trees? Because I speak the two languages that mainly make up the elements that is a tree.
Fair enough.
Just those tiny things that your players can come with you with, like, oh, this might be something cool. If you, like a gardener, in a way, cultivate that and let them feel free to bring forth more of those ideas, you can do a lot with that. And obviously, like, I also do a lot of more structured, like, this is the end where we're going to go, but that's most often for my, like, one-shots, or when we're having, like, a real short campaign. Because at that point, you kind of need that structure to get people somewhere. And at that point, it's often, if you do have players that go off the path, there's still obviously a sort of guidance you can give them. Like, cool, yeah, no, you can entirely do that. Let's just in the background make sure that this shifts over there so we still get where we need to go. But just the most important and powerful tool that RPGs have is allowing players to make choices and things to happen from those choices. Which I adore so much that most of the time when I'm planning a one-shot, I plan 3 adventures. Because I will always give them the option at the start. You want to go to option A, B, or C.
Just make sure that the ship is where they...
Yeah.
It's all lakes and rivers. Yes, you have several rivers. It's like the Telltale games.
All snakes and ladders.
No, fortunately not, but... It's like you have a lake where the story has to be, then you can go 3 rivers, and they all turn to be in the next lake, which with the Telltale story. You can go left or right, but you will end up where you have to be.
Yeah, well, most of the time when I do a one-shot, I kind of make sure it's always a 2-shot more. Because I'll have one session where we do the like setup, because I will legitimately give people 3 different choices. The thing is, I never ask for a background. I do ask for a character concept. It doesn't have to be much. It can be like, I'm an Aarakocra that is obsessed with living forever, or whatever. Like, it doesn't need to be much, but as long as I have a little bit, I can create 3 different adventures that will call to each different character. So all of them will have a reason to go on to one of them. And now it's not about me forcing them along on a quest. It's about them figuring out which quests are going to go on first.
So you
Which is a little bit of work.
One evening character creation, and then a week later the adventure starts?
Something like that. Most of the time, if I can do it, I do like a session 0 with character creation, and then the last half of that is just the start of the story. Because most of the time, the first half of your story, even if you allow them 3 different quests to go on, is the same.
Yeah.
You're in a town, you're meeting with someone to tell you more about the quest, whichever one you chose. Maybe you're meeting with multiple people, that's fine. And then you start on the road towards wherever you're going to go, which, beyond a little bit of flavor in your narration, is just you're on a road until you rest. And that's where you cut off for the next session, where you can do the prep for the actual story you're going to do. You just need an outline of like, that's going to be the enemy, this is the problem that's happening, and this is what the messenger knows. That's about it. And you can prep that in between the next session.
It's actually a really, really good idea.
Yeah, that's a nice concept. I'm definitely not going to steal that.
It is a little bit more work, but it so far it has always worked out immensely well with my players.
Yeah, sounds fun though. Sounds really, really fun with the people.
And the easy thing about it is because it feels so much less railroady because you're giving them a choice on what to do. Even though it's still the exact same. We have an end and we have a start and we're going there.
Yeah. Do you, in general, like play with digital assistants, or do you play like raw with pen and paper as the name states?
As God intended.
The name.
As the gods of dice and pen and paper have foretold, thou shalt use pen and paper. Parchment, maybe even.
I am generally, and maybe this is part of I came from Pathfinder, where it's ridiculously annoying to try and do it with just pen and paper background. But I am pretty big on like bringing in tools that make the game easier, more fun, that kind of stuff. Both in design, but also in tools like digital character sheets and that kind of stuff.
Can you just, for viewers, can you just name a few you use?
Currently for D&D 5e, because I don't feel like shilling out for D&D Beyond, I'm using Adventure Codex, which is a bit opener with like adding my own stuff in. I also for a long time just used like a basic tracker app that you just click for +1s and -1s for like spell slots. I also used to play a druid, so I had a little app that could do like wild shapes for me. Like most of the time, it's about the small things that make it difficult. That is a lot of effort to keep track of, like resource and that kind of stuff that you don't want to have to deal with, especially at the table while you're dealing with other things. But it can also just be like something that's a lot of fun is having a table with a television on top of it. That's your battle map. That can be a great help as well, or just playing music. It's also a digital help. I'm not hiring a band to come play in the corner of my room. So there's a myriad of different things that you can bring to the table to help liven it up a little bit. Like these lights as well. For a decent bit of time when I was still playing, while we're in combat, my character's okay. My character is less okay. Please save me. And oops, too late. You know, there's almost everything that is digital can help you help immerse players into the game if you use it well. It's just about how you learn to use it. It doesn't have to be much, but it can be something bigger like a digital character sheet. Like a lot of people don't like to track inventory. If you can make that a part of your game for the interesting parts that it brings by digitizing that, why not?
Well, I have always a laptop at the table. Once I constantly play some kind of music. It's this generic role-playing music for the different atmospheres. And there's this battle music, exploring, or mystery music. I'm always tracking with Excel the encounters, so we know 6 months from now when it's time to level up, and who's getting which wand and what item. And when I played with my daughter and her friends, we played Tales of Equestria, which is a really nice system. Well, I bought the adventure on an online shop, and I had this 76 pages PDF I didn't want to print out, so I read it from the screen. I followed on the screen what happened. So, and in Pathfinder is so complex. I always have Google open because the rules are well online. And what's this spell putting on effect, and what's this happening? We have lots of cards also where these states are marked. You're now wounded, or you're now lame, or you're blind, or this stuff. But this is analog and not digital. So basically, it's for tracking points, for making ambience and music, and for having the rules, a rule set, or the adventure. Since I'm more relying on the railroading pre-configured adventures, I need the adventure set.
You
and
already
I'm not
said
going
something interesting
to print
there.
this.
Like you said, that's analog, that is not digital. But
No, I have the analog card. There's a card set.
Yeah, no, but that's what I'm talking about, because it's not at the end, it's not about if it's digital or not. It's a tool to help make the game easier.
Yeah, but the cards, they have this charm. You can touch them, you can give them, you can take them, and this. Of course, I could put them. I could send them on WhatsApp on their smartphone. You are now bleeding, but it's something. If you have a card, you can deal with. You can negotiate what you can do. So this is analog, is this touchy feeling, and that's why I don't like dice apps. I prefer rolling the dice, even if dice apps in Star Wars are much more useful, and cheaper. But I think there has to be this haptic feeling, and this is pen and paper. So character sheets, it's a good idea, because our character sheets are always, yes, I know you're a real fan. Character sheets are always, breaking the point where the hit points are marked, because there are so many scribbles and erased. But I think this has to be a good character sheet. I prefer to transcribe it to another character sheet, because it has something to do. Your character is worn out, so you can, after the rest, you can have a new character sheet, and then all the marks can be copied or not. This is, but I'm not against. We have bought in the pandemic a huge 67-inch touchboard table. You can put flat on the table, and we want to do something like hybrid role-playing games, but we never had the permission to do so. We hope we can do this next year, or 23 or 24, to see, because this is the thing, role-playing aids who are really showing out on big screens. So there are some apps developed, and I just want to know if it's something good, or if it's turning your role-playing game into something like Gloomhaven, or a huge board game with complex rules. That's what 4th edition and the Pathfinder, if you take it seriously, is about. It's about miniatures taking place, and you take a ruler. It's like a war game. You take a ruler. Well, he's crossing by the side, so I have an occasional attack, but from the back to the left. And it's to... I understand the appeal, but I never fought this way. And I think just rolling a dice will be enough. But maybe the miniature playing is something I should look into.
Something that I've always held on to is that digitization can't help a bad mechanic.
Yeah.
It's never going to fix that.
And
you can
not a bad
bring
story
digital
either.
element. Yeah. You can bring digital elements to simplify some stuff. Like one of the things that I love using Roll20 with is if you have the compendium in there. If I just want to throw together an encounter on the spot, I can just drag the monsters that I already have just on the field. I can just bring the stats, and I don't have to worry about that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways where you can make that work in an analog fashion. I have designed the action map for D&D, which is there to help theater of the mind combat, where you just have some basic positions to, I can grab it in a second if we want, where you can just put some images on there. You don't have to worry about exact distances, but it just gives you an idea of like, oh, that person's to the north of me, that person's to the south of me, how far away they are, that kind of stuff. If you don't want to have to bother with having to make maps all the time and you want to keep it mostly theater of the mind. Similarly, if you don't want to have to track a ridiculous amount of hit points, especially the GM, just track 1 hit point per 10 hit points. Make them little like crosshatches or whatever that you can just mark down, and you don't have to keep track of as much hit points anymore. Or just literally make them just an amount of hits that it takes to kill them. You need to hit them 5 times and they're dead. There are a lot of ways where you can design around some of the stuff that might make it more difficult otherwise to deal with it. Digitization is never the solution, but it can help make things more accessible when the mechanic itself already works decently well. Like HP, especially for players, works well. There's just nothing saying that a digital version of your hit bar, your health points, is easier to manage than one that you have to squeeze out every time and then write again and then keep track of it that way. Yeah. Especially if through a digital fashion, you can also bring in maybe a way where your token instantly like turns a different color whenever you get to a certain amount of health, where you might see like an actual like health bar going down as you get closer to 0 hit points, etc. There's a bunch of stuff that digitization can bring to even add to that, but it can never save something that was bad to begin with.
Yes.
Well, that's fair enough, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's get to the last part, because we got some minds here at work to say. Let's get a bit into like game design and video games and pen and paper as like the last topic, and start quite simply. Can playing or mastering pen and paper help with being a better game designer?
Definitely.
For sure. Even better, I have talked with people within the game design industry, and they told me, put it on your resume.
Yes.
If you have GM'd for a long ass time, put it on your bloody resume.
It's not only game design, because game designing is not always system design, but you have to deal with different people with different opinions who want to achieve a common goal but don't know where. It's people skills. If you're a game master, you have people skills which will help you everywhere. It's not only in game design. So it's a real competence you put on your resume, or you can profit your whole life from being better. Well, it's in so many situations I thought about, well, this just feels like DMing. Well, I'm the railroader, but just to give people the impression of having a choice, but to achieve the goal, you have to improvise. And if they're turning left, you have to deal with this, but you have the goal in mind, and you have to deal with the situation without being too bossy or too pushy. And this is something you learn improvising with different opinions in game mastering. And game designing is just an application of this tool set.
For sure. Like RPGs are the only place in our world where we can safely train or exercise our social skills. If we do that IRL with people, if we fail, we actually fail, and people will have a different opinion of us or whatever. As players and as a GM, while role-playing, we can try out different characters, we can try out different things, and we can train our social skills in a way without consequence where we could never do that in the real world.
And by RPG, you don't talking of fantasy role-playing, but role-playing.
Any.
Yes.
No matter what it is. And it will always teach you stuff like teamwork. To a certain extent, planning, depending on what your group is like. But also just communicating, people skills in so many ways. On top of that, especially when you play games that are a bit more like Pathfinder, Dungeons and Dragons, Stars Without Number, that are a bit more gritty, especially if they're encounters and that kind of stuff, you have to, especially as a GM, constantly design encounters and adjust them on the fly often as well, because you can't playtest your encounters, because the playtest is when you're playing.
Yeah, true.
So you are, especially if you're a GM for a longer time, you can sometimes have 3 encounters you need to playtest on a day. And try to hope that they kind of work out well and get a sense for what works well and what doesn't. And then on top of that, you often have players that want to do something special. So you start homebrewing and looking into how you can adjust the rules to fit a specific purpose. And And just on its own, because role-playing games are such a pure version of game mechanics in this way, of system design, even just as a player, you're getting a better insight on how these systems work just from figuring out how your character works. Especially, for example, in Pathfinder, figuring out that your base attack bonus is based on either a third, 2/3, or your full level, and how that scales with you, especially if you multi-class in specific ways, and how your saves work in the same way, but depending on like what kind of class you have, etc. All of that is just understanding system design better, because it's such that there is no cover above it like a game that does most of that work for you, and you don't see that and you just deal with it. Like especially with Pathfinder, when I started, we used Hero Labs to create our character sheets. At some point I learned to not do that, especially not with new players, because that is the cover that a normal game has that keeps you away from the rules. But if you do that with an RPG, you won't know what you can do with your character, because you've never interacted with the rules before you. You don't know how the systems work. So now everything about your character is a mystery to you.
Yeah. Understandable.
And I think if you ever learned rules like Pathfinder or D&D with several hundred of pages, you aren't afraid of anything. Any board game, any rule set is like, okay, it's only 30 pages, or this is a manual 40 pages. It's not less complex, but you lose every inhibition to dive into really complex systems, because I think it's the most complex systems is in role-playing games, with their add-ons and Monster Compendium 1, 2, 3, 4, and magics of the north and herbs of the south. And if you want, you have to know where to look at. You don't have to have everything in your mind, but you have to juggle all these concepts. And it's daunting, but once you're in it, nothing can shock you.
Yeah. You fool, you think your puny little rule book will scare me? I've learned Pathfinder back in the day.
Yeah, it's like this. I learned D&D back in the days. It was not as complex as D&D 3.5, which became Pathfinder on the way. I once played the original Dungeons & Dragons from 1974 in a one-shot because I wanted to know how this played out. It's so
surprisingly simple in a way.
Yeah, it's so minimalist, and we could do anything because so few things were stated on the rules. Of course, it
everything's
the
a D6.
Pardon?
Everything's a D6.
Yes, and there has the limitations of Dungeons and Dragons, so race and class mixed. But we could really we had a nice evening, and this was, I think, 20 pages, 30 pages of rule sets, and most of this was known for today, but it was an historical experience. So I think they had a good time in the 70s with those rules, and they don't need thousands of pages to have a good campaign. You can deal with much less. This is one of the lessons of the indie role-playing game movement. You can really have rules very minimalistic and have a really good time.
I just want to point out, because I used it as a joke before, but this is Fate Accelerated, and this is the entire rule set.
Yes.
And you can play an infinite amount of games with this, because this is setting free. This doesn't have like a fantasy setting that comes with it.
But I'm still glad.
You need to buy some special dice, but
I'm still glad I worked through the Pathfinder rule sets, and I have lots of books, because it's something. It's like telling grandpa is talking about the old wartime from the Clone Wars. But it's something.
Well, I guess I'm a grandpa too, then, because I can talk with you about all of that. Don't worry, I'm there with you.
So
I do want to point out with that is, especially if you're also interested as someone that's a gaming student or something along those lines, don't just stick with one game. Pathfinder taught me a lot about game design and about systems design and that kind of stuff. But it taught me a lot about that because I stopped playing Pathfinder. Because I saw I went to other games. This game is nearly as complex as that Pathfinder is. This is the Burning Wheel. In very different ways, and it's way better designed. But going through these different systems, seeing what makes them work, also teaches you better what doesn't work in other systems. I'm one of Pathfinder's biggest defenders because it does a lot of things real well, but that's also because I know it does a lot of things real bad. I went through different systems, and especially like a lot of people only see Dungeons and Dragons because it's the big thing right now. But so many games are being forced into the form that is Dungeons and Dragons, while they should be played in a plethora of different systems. There's dozens of games within the Powered by the Apocalypse system that is way easier to pick up and work way better towards that kind of game. There is I forget the name of it, but it's this Western game that actually works with cards as well and that kind of stuff. That works way better if you want to run a Western type game. There's Stars Without Numbers if you want to run an online, more like space, science fiction, space fantasy kind of game. There is Mothership, which is a kind of like a space sci-fi horror game if you want to play that. There are so many systems out there for you to play that can do the thing that you want to do probably so much better than 5e ever can.
Yes. I watched that RPG Geek talks about 13,000 systems. It's listed 13,000 systems. So for everything you find. But to come back to your question, I think another good lesson would be to design your proper game, and not the 1,000 pages, but a small set of rules, and take it to the table. So there you learn system design and what works, what does not work, how you think something is balanced, and you have to give it up because it turned out to be very bad. And this is something like rule improvisation is, I think, a competence you need as game designer, even if you have more time to balance your system, but you get something like an intuition which could work, which should be more stated out, and which could be left open. I think we have a couple of students every year making a role-playing system as in a final project. So we have some experience with this. It's harder than you think, because to have a good game, you need 1 page, but for a final project, you need 80 pages, and to balance 80 pages is much more difficult than balance 1 or 2 pages, because they are balancing at the table. But a system which needs to be, which to treat all the aspects of a role-playing world is far more difficult than, if you're just playing and you're accustomed to the rule set. This is why Baldur's Gate worked so well in the 90s, because they bought the D&D license. They had an already balanced system they had to put in a computer. So all the gold box stuff, they bought AD&D, and they put computers around, so the games worked. They were tested in thousands or hundreds of thousands of games at the table. But if you have to design, a lot better
than AD&D itself, because you didn't have to keep track of FAQ.
Yeah. Sometimes even better, yes. But if you have to design your own game from scratch or from experience, and I'm doing everything better than the other games, and you turn out to be a rather good designer if you come out with something that's working.
Yes.
You get a feel for balance, and that's so important in game design.
This is one of the greatest strengths of 5e, in my experience. If you want to learn to do more game design stuff, try and make some small adjustments to 5e. First, just start with homebrewing an item or something like that, just to get a feel of it. But at some point, try and take one of the basic systems and try and adjust it a little bit, and just see what effect it has on so many parts of the system everywhere. And all these tiny little wrinkles that just ripple out of things that you now need to fix. Oh, I need to fix that. Oh, I need to fix that. Oh, that's now wrong. All these tiny little things, that's where you really start to get a sense of, oh, this is how the system works. And this is where it leads to. And that gives you a way better feel of how to design your own system at some point.
Yes. Okay, last question for the evening. That's a bit of a difficult question, because gaming industry, you could say, developed from pen and papers. Like, the first was, at least for RPGs, pen and papers, and somehow they learn from each other. But do you have something in mind right now that modern day gaming industry could learn again, or learn from pen and papers?
I mean, I will leave the professor to go first in this one.
The professor has.
I definitely have ideas.
The professor has not finished thinking.
I can start. I'm a bard. I just start talking. I figure it out while I go. Don't worry about it. So yeah, the interesting thing is looking at like so much of the current like video game stuff that we have is already coming from RPGs like this. Like RPGs way back started as like a war game somewhere in Prussia way back when, and eventually started growing out to the point where Gygax, and I forget the name of the other guy. This is what you have to do it on the spot. Yeah. Started building out chainmail and eventually D&D. And this is where you start looking into the games that came out at the time, stuff like NetHack, but also at some point Final Fantasy 1 and that kind of stuff, where you see all of these games grab a small element out of those games that they can make happen in a video game space. Because there's so many limitations to what you can and can't happen. Over time, this grows and starts adding in different genres, and you can start seeing now so many games that have this very strong focus on one part of what an RPG was, instead of all of it what it is, with the role playing, with the combat that comes in there, the quick thinking in a way, and the solution based design. Most of the time, when a game is somewhere RPG focused, it focuses on one of those elements. But also just like leveling, which you can see in so many more games now, where it's just like a progression system, which is also a part that came out of that. The problem with the blockade that we find now is that what remains of RPGs that we can't simulate yet are either things where we need to get computers that are so smart that they can simulate problem solving like we can. Where they can create their own solutions, not pull from a list of already preset solutions. The other problem is that even now, no matter how much more space we have when it comes to like processing and rendering and that kind of stuff, to render the complexity that is an entire like RPG world will take too many resources to put that all in. Because you need to have the AI capable of like doing all of these different things, be it either fighting, be it role playing, be it like the basic progression systems and making things grow based on what you're doing. So many games have already tried this and can do one or two of those. But once you start adding all in, your games are going to become so big that it's going to become difficult for your players to even know what they're going to do. Because that's one of the great things about having a GM. The GM can see what the players are interested in and start guiding it towards that. But how many of us have played a game with a new player that was entirely lost on day one because they're like, wait, what am I do? What can I do? Where am I going? What is going on? I can do that? And the guidance that they have from the players around them and from a GM that can play into their interests helps them guide this entire game into what that group wants that game to be. But that's in part also because you have a group there. And you can't really do that with just a computer and just you. Mm-hmm. I also kind of lost track of the original question along that road.
I'm sorry, just a like follow-up statement request. Kind of, do you think it would be good if there somehow would be a way to have a game master in a computer game RPG?
Do you know AI Dungeon? It's a Google project, yes, where you can type in, you do what you want and the system reacts and is telling the story. It's the first step towards an artificial intelligence game master. Very impressive, very limited, but it gives a feeling what maybe in 10 or 20 years computer-assisted role-playing could look like.
But there's a reason that it's a text-based adventure.
Yeah, of course. But every adventure started text-based in the computer realm. So, but I think to come back to your question, one thing, the most memorable moments in role-playing game, what we discussed this evening, were these emergent situations where you have to improvise and you don't know what's happening. And I think computer games are really good in this, to putting up some systems, really complex system, taking care of most of it, but you don't know where this is going to be, and you have something like a story generator. It's not the railroaded story where you know from the beginning everyone will have the same story experience. this is AAA, it's working like this, but the small indie successes are more often than not something with emergent storytelling or emergent gameplay. And if you can put this multiplayer, this is Minecraft multiplayer. You have the sandbox, but if you put something like quests or storylines in it, this could be really interesting, where the balancing happens on a social level and not only on the system level, and where the system adapts for what you want to achieve in this world. It's more open world, emergent, and not so, well, we have to achieve something to get the next bit of the story, which has been already told. I think this is the most fascinating aspect of computer games, this experience of systems and not the experience of a story. They are a better medium to tell a story, a linear story, which already has been told.
Yes, I agree. So thanks a lot. It was a hell of a ride, 2 hours talking. I'm also very, very proud of everyone who got to this part. I think it was an amazing conversation we had. And is there anything, any last words from you want to say?
I feel like we barely started.
Perhaps that's the teaser for part 2.
Yeah, like I said at the start, I'll reiterate it now. The main point, the most important point, is to just have fun with your friends at a table. Nothing else matters.
I think it's more than having fun. I'm deeply objected against the idea that games are just for having fun. I'm not sure you're talking about this kind of fun. This is
for sure.
I think the notion of fun is different than Spaß in German, which is so superficial. Fun might be more engaging, but even a role-playing experience is more than fun. It's more like a roller coaster ride. Is something you can impacts you and transforms you for the better or the worse. But it's really something which you can take in your heart for years to come. And I know it because I have several years in advance. It's something you take, it can deeply transform your life. And fun does not have this quality. And that's why I'm not opposed to the notion of fun, but I think not what you wanted to say.
We're way more aligned than you maybe think. Maybe let me rephrase. The important thing is that all of you at the table have a good time.
Yes.
That good time can be you all suffering from major depression in Barovia as everyone around you dies. That is entirely fine with me. You make up what is a good time for all of you. But make sure, at the end of the day, you're there to have a good time with your friends.
Yeah.
That is what playing a role-play game, especially for the people that are newer to role-playing games,
yes,
are trying to figure out why they would even try. So it's just about having fun, about having a good time. And if that fun has to do with less fun subject matter, I'm entirely on board. If you didn't notice, I not too long ago gave a talk for the exact same university about how to use terrible mechanics to tell very impactful stories.
We're still waiting for the publication of this talk to participate.
Well, hopefully it's out when this comes out. So
okay,
I'm very well aligned with you on that. But yes, at the end of the day, there is generally no audience. There is no show. You're just there with your friends. Make sure you have fun in your own way.
That's a fine closing statement. So thank you all for watching, and perhaps see you next time.
Let's see.
Bye. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.